They cut my trees so they could have a better view. And for a while, I actually thought maybe it was just some kind of mistake. Turns out, it wasn't a mistake at all, it was a decision. And that decision ended up costing a man everything he built his life around. I own about 40 acres up in the mountains, not the fancy kind of mountain property you see on postcards, more like the kind you earn over time, steep in places, quiet in others, full of hardwood trees that have been standing longer than I've been alive. I bought it back in the early 90s when nobody really cared about land like that, especially not the kind that sits halfway up a ridge with a gravel road that turns to mud every time it rains. Back then, it felt like I'd found something no one else was looking for, which was exactly what I wanted. The cabin I built wasn't much to look at, just a small structure tucked into the slope, surrounded by oak and hickory, with a porch that faced the valley. In the mornings, the fog would sit low like a blanket, and by midday, the sun would break through just enough to warm the wood without ever making it too hot. Deer would pass through like they owned the place, and honestly, I never minded. It felt like I was the guest out there, not them. For years, everything above me stayed untouched. About 25 acres of rocky incline, too steep for most folks to bother with, too expensive to develop without serious commitment. I used to hike up there sometimes, just to see how far the ridge stretched, and every time I did, I'd think the same thing. If anyone ever buys this land, they're going to want the view, and if they want the view, they're going to come for the trees. Still, that thought stayed in the back of my mind, never quite real enough to worry about. Life moved on, seasons came and went, and the forest did what forests do. It grew, slowly, quietly, without asking for permission. Then one spring, I started hearing machinery. Not the distant kind you ignore, but the kind that echoes through the hills and makes you stop what you're doing because it doesn't belong there. Chainsaws, heavy equipment, trucks grinding up the dirt road like they owned it. I remember standing on my porch that first morning, coffee in hand, listening to it bounce off the ridge, and thinking, well, I guess somebody finally bought it. I found out a few days later it was a guy named Evan Mercer, came in from out of state, money behind him, big plans from what people were saying in town. He wasn't looking to live in the mountains the way I did. He was looking to build something that stood above them, something glassy and modern that could look out over the valley like it owned the whole horizon. And to be honest, I didn't have a problem with that. It was his land. He paid for it, same as I did mine. The noise got annoying sometimes, sure, especially early in the mornings, but I figured construction has an end date, it always does. So I kept to myself, let them do their thing, and trusted that eventually, things would settle down again. But then one morning, something felt off. I couldn't tell you exactly what it was at first, just a kind of wrongness in the air. The light coming through the trees was different, sharper, almost too bright, like someone had opened a window where there hadn't been one before. I stepped out onto the porch, squinting a little, trying to figure out what had changed, and that's when it hit me. I could see sky, not just a little bit through the branches, but a wide, open stretch of it, clear and uninterrupted in a way I had never seen from that spot before. And my stomach dropped. I didn't even grab my jacket, just started walking uphill, faster than I should have on that kind of slope, slipping a couple times on loose dirt, but not stopping. The closer I got, the quieter it felt, which didn't make any sense because construction had been going on all week. And then I reached the edge of it, and just stood there. They hadn't just cleared a few trees. They had carved a path straight down the mountain. Wide, clean, deliberate. Everything in that strip was gone, nothing left but stumps, broken branches, and piles of debris pushed to the side like it didn't matter. It cut through the forest like a scar, and for a second, I honestly couldn't process what I was looking at, because it didn't feel real, not in a place that had been untouched for as long as I'd known it. Then I noticed something worse. The line didn't stop where it should have. It kept going, right onto my land. I walked along the edge, counting without meaning to, recognizing trees I'd known for years, a tall oak that leaned slightly to the east, a pair of hickories that grew close together like they were competing, all of them gone. Not damaged, not trimmed, gone. Cut clean at the base like they were nothing more than obstacles in someone else's plan. I remember letting out a breath that didn't feel like mine, just standing there with my hands on my hips, trying to stay calm and failing at it, because this wasn't just about trees anymore. This was about someone deciding that what I owned didn't matter as much as what they wanted. And right then, I knew I needed to find him. I headed further up the slope toward the sound of voices. boots crunching on gravel, equipment idling nearby. And sure enough, there he was, standing over a set of blueprints spread across the hood of a truck, talking to one of the crew like he had everything under control. I walked straight up to him, didn't wait to be invited, didn't bother with introductions. "You the one in charge here?" He barely looked up at first, just nodded like I was another worker asking a question. "Yeah, what's up?" I pointed back down the slope, toward the stretch of land that used to be mine. "You crossed the property line." That got his attention. He looked at me properly then, eyes narrowing just a bit, like he was trying to decide how seriously to take me. "We cleared what we needed to open the view," he said, casual as anything. "That's part of the build." "That's my land," I said, keeping my voice steady even though everything in me wanted to raise it. "Those are my trees." He glanced past me, like he could see it from where he stood, then shrugged, actually shrugged. "They're just trees," he said. "They grow back." And in that moment, something shifted inside me. Not loud, not explosive, just quiet and certain. Because I realized he didn't think this was a problem. He thought it was a transaction. And that was where he got it wrong. He said it like it was nothing, like he'd bumped into a fence post or tracked mud onto the wrong driveway. "They're just trees." And I remember standing there thinking, you don't get it, not even a little bit. Those trees weren't decoration. They weren't blocking a view. They were the reason the place existed the way it did: shade in the summer, windbreak in the winter, roots holding the slope together when the rains came hard. And yeah, maybe that sounds sentimental, but when you live somewhere long enough, the line between land and memory gets real thin. I took a step closer to him, not aggressive, just enough to make sure he couldn't ignore me. "You cut at least 40 feet into my property," I said, slow and clear. "That's not a misunderstanding. That's trespassing." He sighed, like I was making his day harder than it needed to be, and finally folded up the papers on his truck. "Look," he said, lowering his voice a little, like we were about to have a reasonable conversation. "If we clipped a few of your trees, we'll square it up. I'll have someone clean the debris, make it look nice again. No need to get worked up over it." "A few trees." I almost laughed, but there wasn't anything funny about it. "You wiped out a section of forest." He gave me that same shrug again, only this time with a hint of impatience. "What do you want, man? $500? 1,000? Just tell me a number and we'll move on." And that right there, that was the moment I stopped thinking of this as something we could talk through. Because it wasn't about the money he was offering, it was about the way he said it, like everything had a price, and once he named one, the problem would just disappear. I shook my head. "I want you off my property," I said. "And you're going to hear from my lawyer." That got a reaction, just a flicker of it, but I saw it. Not fear exactly, more like annoyance, like I'd decided to make things inconvenient. "Do what you gotta do," he said, already turning back to his plans. "But this isn't as big a deal as you think it is." I didn't answer him after that. There wasn't anything left to say. I just turned around and walked back down the slope, slower this time, feeling every step, every stump, every gap where something used to be. By the time I got back to the cabin, I wasn't angry in that loud, explosive way people expect. I was focused, and sometimes that's worse. I called a guy I'd known about 10 years, name of Daniel Crow. His family had been in the area longer than most roads, and if there was something to know about land disputes, boundary lines, timber rights, Daniel either knew it or knew someone who did. He picked up on the second ring. "You don't usually call this early," he said. "Had some trees cut," I told him. "Problem is, they weren't theirs." There was a pause on the line, just long enough for him to understand what I meant. "How far in?" 40 feet, give or take." Another pause, this one heavier. "You talked to him?" "Yeah." "And?" "He offered me $1,000. Daniel let out a low whistle. "All right, don't touch anything. Don't clean it up, don't move a branch. Take pictures of everything, stumps, boundary markers, the whole stretch. Then come by my office this afternoon." I spent the next few hours doing exactly that. Walking the line, photographing every cut, every marker I could find, even the piles of slash they'd pushed aside. The more I documented, the clearer it became. This wasn't sloppy work. The cut was straight, consistent, intentional. You don't accidentally clear a corridor like that. When I got to Daniel's office, he was already looking over the photos on his computer, leaning back in his chair with that expression he gets when something's about to turn serious. "Well," he said, tapping the screen, "they didn't just wander over the line. They committed timber trespass." I sat down across from him. What does that mean for me? It means, he said, turning the monitor slightly so I could see the images. In this state, if someone cuts your timber without permission, they don't just pay what it's worth, they pay 3 times the value. I blinked. 3 times. Treble damages, he nodded. It's meant to discourage exactly this kind of thing. People can't just take what they want and write a check after. That was the first moment I felt something shift back in my direction. Not relief exactly, but a sense that this wasn't going to end with me being dismissed. What do we need? I asked. A forester, Daniel said. Someone certified who can assess each tree, species, size, age, market value, ecological value. We build the number properly, not just a guess. A couple days later, we had one out on the property. Older guy, methodical, didn't say much while he worked. He measured every stump, made notes, took samples, even walked the slope a second time just to double-check his counts. Watching him work, I realized something. This was the first person since it happened who treated those trees like they mattered. When he finished, he handed us the report a week later. Daniel called me in to go over it. Total valuation, he said, sliding the paper across the desk. Just over 40,000. I stared at the number, doing the math in my head. So tripled. 123,000, he said. I let out a breath, long and slow. That wasn't pocket change. That was real money, enough to make someone stop and reconsider what they'd done. Daniel drafted a demand letter, formal, detailed, backed by the report, and sent it off to Mercer's attorney. For a few days, nothing happened. Then the call came in. Daniel had me sit in while he took it, phone on speaker. This is ridiculous, the other lawyer said, voice sharp, controlled. Your client is inflating damages over what amounts to minor clearing. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He never does. Your client crossed a marked boundary and removed mature timber. The valuation is supported by a licensed forester. 5,000, the lawyer said. That's our offer to settle this without wasting everyone's time. I felt something tighten in my chest hearing that number. Not because I wanted more, but because it told me they still didn't take it seriously. Daniel leaned back in his chair. That won't be acceptable, he said. If your client would prefer, we can let a judge decide. There was a pause, then a short, dismissive laugh. Do what you think is best. The line went dead. Daniel looked at me. You ready to take this all the way? I didn't hesitate. Yeah, I said. I am. So we filed. And that's when things started to change. Because once it was in the system, once depositions started getting scheduled, once people were asked to go on record, the story stopped being flexible. It stopped being something Mercer could smooth over with a check or a shrug. We brought in the surveyor who had originally marked the boundary line. He showed up with photos, documentation, even timestamps of when the markers were placed. Bright flags, clearly visible, spaced exactly where they were supposed to be. Then came the crew foreman. I remember sitting in that room during his deposition, watching him shift in his chair, clearly uncomfortable but determined to tell the truth. Daniel asked him one simple question. Were the boundary markers visible before the clearing began? The foreman nodded. Yes, sir, they were. And were they in the same location when the cutting started? That's when he hesitated, just for a second. Then he shook his head. No, sir. They'd been moved. Daniel didn't react, just followed up. Moved by whom? The foreman swallowed, glanced briefly toward Mercer's side of the table, then answered. Mr. Mercer moved them, told us the original line was wrong. And just like that, everything changed. Because now it wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was intentional. That one sentence. He moved them. It just kind of hung in the room, heavier than anything else that had been set up to that point, and you could feel the shift immediately, not just in me, but in everyone sitting there. Up until then, Mercer still had a little room to argue, a little space to pretend this was some kind of honest mistake, a misread line, a bad assumption. But once the foreman said that, under oath, with no hesitation left in his voice, that space closed. I remember looking over at Mercer, and for the first time since all this started, he wasn't relaxed anymore. No leaning back, no half smile, no casual confidence. Just tight shoulders, eyes fixed on the table, like if he didn't move, maybe it wouldn't land as hard. Daniel didn't press it right away. He just nodded, let the silence do its work, then moved on like it was just another detail. But we both knew that was the case now. Everything else was just going to be built around that moment. After the depositions wrapped, Daniel pulled me aside in the hallway. "This isn't just trespass anymore," he said. "This is willful. That opens the door for punitive damages." I nodded, even though I didn't fully understand what that meant yet. "So, more than the triple?" "Potentially," he said. "Depends on the judge. But intentional misconduct tends to get attention." And it did. The trial itself wasn't dramatic in the way people think. No shouting, no surprise witnesses bursting through the doors, none of that. It was steady, methodical, almost quiet at times, which somehow made it feel even more serious. Every piece of evidence laid out clean, every testimony consistent, every timeline lining up exactly the way it needed to. The surveyor explained how he'd marked the boundary, how clear the line was, how difficult it would be to mistake it for anything else. The forester walked through the valuation, tree by tree, explaining not just the market value but the maturity, the years it took for hardwoods like that to reach that size. And the foreman, he repeated what he'd already said, simple and direct, no embellishment, no hesitation. When it was Mercer's turn, his lawyer tried to reframe everything. Said the project required a clear view, said the terrain made it difficult to determine exact boundaries, said any movement of markers was done under the belief they were inaccurate. It sounded polished, practiced, but it didn't land the way it might have before. Not after everything that had already been established. At one point, the judge leaned forward slightly, looking directly at Mercer. "Are you telling this court," he said, calm but firm, "that you altered boundary markers without confirming their accuracy through a licensed survey?" There was a pause, just long enough to feel uncomfortable. "I believe they were incorrect," Mercer said. "That wasn't my question," the judge replied. "Did you confirm that belief through proper channels?" Mercer hesitated again, and that hesitation, it said more than anything else could have. "No," he admitted. "That was it. Not a dramatic moment, not loud, not explosive, just quiet accountability settling into place." When the ruling came down, it was just as steady. The judge went through each component, clear and deliberate, like he wanted there to be no confusion about how he arrived at the final number. Treble damages on the timber value, $123,000. Punitive damages, based on intentional misconduct, $47,000. Legal fees, $28,000. And on top of that, a requirement that Mercer fund a full reforestation plan for the affected area. Total judgment, just under $200,000. I remember sitting there, hands folded, not reacting right away. Not because I wasn't feeling anything, but because it takes a second for something like that to settle in, to feel real. Mercer didn't stay as composed. As soon as the numbers were read, he leaned toward his attorney, whispering something sharp, urgent. Then he looked up, pale, eyes wide in a way I hadn't seen before. "I can't pay that," he said, not to me, not even really to his lawyer, just out loud, like the room might adjust itself if he said it clearly enough. The judge didn't raise his voice. "Then you should not have taken what wasn't yours," he said. Simple as that. And just like that, it was over. But not really. Because the ruling was one thing, collecting on it was another. Daniel moved fast. Within days, he placed a lien on Mercer's property, which, as it turns out, is the kind of thing banks pay very close attention to. The financing Mercer had lined up for his build, it didn't survive that. The bank pulled out, just like that, and construction stopped almost overnight. I went up there a few weeks later, mostly out of curiosity, and the place felt different already. Quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. This was unfinished quiet, heavy, awkward. The structure he'd started was still there, steel framing exposed, materials stacked and covered, like someone had just walked away mid-sentence. Months went by. 8, maybe 9. Nothing moved. No crews, no equipment, no progress. Just that half-built shell sitting on the ridge, overlooking a view it had cost too much to claim. Eventually, the property went up for sale. Lower than what he'd paid for it, from what I heard. It didn't move right away either. Turns out, a place tied up in a legal judgment isn't exactly attractive to buyers. But after a while, someone picked it up, probably seeing potential where Mercer's plans had collapsed. As for Mercer, I don't know all the details of what happened after, and honestly, I didn't go looking. I heard enough through town to piece together the basics. That the judgment wiped him out financially, that he had to cover the remaining reforestation costs out of pocket, that whatever project he thought he was building up there never really recovered. And me? I went back to my land. The first year after everything, the slope looked rough. Saplings planted in rows, small, fragile, nothing like what had been there before. It would have been easy to look at that and feel like something was lost for good. But forests don't work like that. They come back. 3 years later, those saplings were already taller than me in some places, leaves filling in, shade starting to return, the line of that cut slowly softening as the land reclaimed itself. It's not the same forest, not yet. Maybe not in my lifetime. But it's alive again, and that counts for something. Every now and then, I walk that stretch, stop where the line used to feel so sharp, and just stand there for a minute. Not angry anymore. Not even satisfied in the way people expect when they hear how it ended. Just aware. Because here's the thing nobody really talks about. Mercer wasn't wrong for wanting a view. People come to the mountains for that. The open sky, the long distance, the feeling of standing above something bigger than you. I get it. I really do. Where he went wrong was thinking he could take that view from someone else and square it up later. That the land was just pieces on a map, lines you could move if they got in your way. And maybe, in a different situation, with a different person, he gets away with it. Maybe someone takes the money, shrugs it off, tells themselves it's not worth the fight. But that's the part one keep coming back to. What is it worth to hold your ground when someone decides it doesn't matter? Not just the money, not just the outcome, but the principle of it. Because I didn't go looking for a fight. I didn't want one. But once it showed up on my doorstep, or in this case, halfway up my ridge, I had a choice. Let it go, or stand up for it. And I chose to stand. So I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have taken the $1,000 and moved on? Or would you have done exactly what I did and pushed it all the way through, knowing it could drag on for months, maybe years? And on the other side of that, do you think Mercer deserved what happened to him? Or was the punishment too much for what started as just trees? Let me know in the comments. Because stories like this, they're never as simple as they sound at the beginning.